All right, welcome again. This session is going to be about federal housing policy. It had a much longer title that was a little more ambitious when my colleague Peter dreamed it up a few months back. And we will talk about Build Back Better and the potential for that, formerly known as Build Back Better. But before we do that, I want to just make sure to welcome the four people to my right. Each flew across the country yesterday to be here with you. They made a big effort to be here in this still strange time when it's still hard to recognize each other with masks on. But it feels fantastic to be here sharing this panel. And I'm going to start by introducing myself. I'm Matt Schwartz with the California Housing Partnership. And one of the things that we love to do is to bring together experts in housing production, preservation, and funding policy from across the country to share wisdom, answer questions. So I'm really happy to be your moderator today. I also want to recognize my colleague, Christina Gotuaco, our communications director in the back. Christina is moderating the online portion of this workshop and will be feeding me questions as we go from section to section. Our panelists, to my immediate right, Peter Lawrence, Director of Public Policy with Novogradac & Co. And I should have asked each of you to think about your California connections before. Peter always wants me to remind all of us that he went to UC Berkeley many years ago and therefore has a California connection. Oh, you did? All right, we'll give you some credit for that. And Nan Roman, CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness for at least a little bit longer. And Nan, do you have a California connection that you can, make sure the mic is working there. Let's see. It's working.
Okay, yes? Oh. I do have a connection. My brother lives in San Francisco. So I will be seeing him tomorrow night.
We'll take that. Thanks, Nan. To Nan's right, Sarah Sadian, who should be a familiar face to many of you, Senior Vice President for Public Policy at the National Income Housing Coalition, which provides many of us with regular updates, which we deeply appreciate. And Sarah, what's your California connection?
The most recent one is I took a vacation in California last month. It was really beautiful up the coast. So.
All right, glad you enjoyed that drive without any disasters striking. And to Sarah's right is someone who also may be familiar because he worked for Housing California for the better part of 2 years. Luke Villalobos now is Policy Director for the National Housing Conference. And Luke, you told me that you worked for the mayor of Riverside,
yes,
which
indeed.
I'd forgotten about. So
Yeah.
you have both coastal and inland
Yes.
California.
My wife's family is from Topanga Canyon, so we have coastal connections out there, and I worked for a couple of years in the city of Riverside in the mayor's office, working on Mayor Bailey's Love Your Neighbor initiative, which was the initiative to end, bring to functional zero homelessness in the city of Riverside, as well as build more housing.
Okay, we may need to check back on how that worked out, but I think we have a lot of those initiatives and good efforts, and we're now going to turn to the agenda. The topics we're going to cover today are related. They're all eventually mostly about funding. There is some room to also talk about policy that doesn't directly relate to funding, but they're in a couple of buckets. So the very first bucket we'll be discussing will be the federal spending bill that was just approved last month. And then we'll turn to the President Biden's new proposed funding that would in theory go into play in October. And then we'll look at, relatedly, what used to be called Build Back Better, and we're now thinking of as the dreaded budget reconciliation word, which we will go into in more detail. And then we're going to talk about regulatory and administrative initiatives from DC as well, and then close with, if you have a chance to talk to a member of Congress, what are a couple of talking points that this panel would urge you to consider from a California perspective? So that's our agenda. We're going to be taking questions at the end of each section. We'll be going to you first who are here in this room, and then if there's time, we'll be looking to see who's online with questions from that forum as well. So let's dig in. Let's start with the spending bill that just was approved and signed into law, which on the one hand is kind of exciting. The first spending bill, I believe, that was done after the spending caps that were negotiated during President Obama's era have expired. There are some significant increases, at least on paper. And yet, in the context of waiting for this Build Back Better that never happened or hasn't happened yet, it also feels a little dispiriting and disappointing. So Sarah, how should we be thinking about the fiscal year 2022 housing package that was approved by Congress and the President?
Are these ones working now?
Testing? Not hearing sound. Maybe try the mic again.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, so I definitely agree. It's disappointing, especially when you have this much larger possibility that's looming. But even if you look at the bill itself, there's about $4 billion more in direct spending from the year prior, which is really good. $4 billion is $4 billion, but we were hoping for a lot more because the final numbers came out to be less than what the president had proposed, less than what the House had proposed, less than what the Senate had proposed. So it was disappointing that we didn't see a higher overall number. And a significant portion of the new money that came in went to earmarks, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that definitely eats up into some of the funding that could otherwise be used to expand programs. And I think the place where you see that have played out the most is with the proposal that the House included to expand housing choice vouchers to another 125,000 families. In the end, we got 25,000 new vouchers, again, an improvement, not just keeping level funding and current levels of service, but it's a lot lower than what it could have been and lower than what the president had proposed for. We did see...
just a quick pause on that,
Yeah.
Sarah, just to translate. So 25,000 vouchers nationally. California tends to have a little more than 15%, I believe, of the total voucher supply. So just roughly speaking, if it were going to be, those were going to be allocated on a pro rata basis, which you just reminded me they're not necessarily, that would mean we'd be having somewhere in the order of somewhere less than 4,000 new vouchers for California. Actually, more than that. Somewhere around there.
Right, it's far less than what California needs, far less than what the country needs. But it reminds us, I think, of how important it is that we keep up our advocacy when we're looking to FY23, because that process is just now starting to kick off, and that's really a place where we can all have a collective impact.
That's great. Thank you. Let me just follow up. Let's talk about earmarks for a minute. Some of us have been doing this for long enough that we remember there used to be these things called earmarks, which is a really strange term. Do any of you know the history? Where did the term earmark, congressional earmark, come from?
I don't know.
Anyone know? I should have looked this up.
I believe it's because the way they write on the appropriations bill, they would mark, here's where you add here, and then they would list all the various projects, and that the little mark on the side of the appropriations bill was,
Looks
called
like an ear?
Looks like an ear.
Okay, we'll go with that, unless someone Googles it and gets a better
I don't believe
answer.
that at all.
So
That's why
what's happening now? What are members, California's delegation, what are they able to do now that they weren't able to do a couple of years ago, Sarah?
Yeah, so the return of earmarks really means that members of Congress can make requests for specific projects that they want to see funding go towards. And there were a lot of great projects in California. I looked up a list of them before I came here, but there was an affordable housing project in Hawthorne, money going to Project Room Key or Home Key, preservation efforts, homeless response efforts. So it's not that the projects are necessarily bad, it just eats into funding that would otherwise go towards other programs. And if you look at the overall increase to HUD's budget, which was about $4 billion, $1.5 billion of that was for earmarks. And to give you a sense of the scale of this, there were about 1,000 earmarks on the THUD bill, including transportation and housing programs. So you can see how, and this was the first year of having earmarks back, you can see how that has a real potential to continue to be a major focus of Congress going forward.
And just putting this in perspective, what I've read, correct me if there's a better version of this, each member of Congress has roughly 10 million to work with in California. That's what I've been reading.
I think they
Not-
just increased it for this year, maybe to 15, is that right?
15 million?
And
Go
that's
ahead,
what it
Peter.
is in theory, right?
Right.
You know, you have a request, you put in a request to your member of Congress, but then there's this negotiation on the appropriations process, and it really is dependent on, do you have an influential member on the appropriations committee who is gonna fight for you? And so if you do have that member, earmarks are great, because they cut through the federal bureaucracy to make sure your project gets funding. But if you don't have a member on the appropriations committee, you're at a disadvantage in the process. And that's, I think part of the reason why some people criticize having earmarks. I mean, the theory, I think, is, though, if you have a process where members of Congress ask for something and it is included, it makes it harder to vote against the end bill. Over the past 10 years, we've seen a sort of breakdown in the appropriations process where people feel free to just vote against keeping the government going. And the theory is by bringing back earmarks, now that they have something specific, tangible for their district, that they're potentially voting on, that makes it harder to vote no and perhaps help the appropriations process go forward.
Nan?
I was just going to say, it looked to me like there are about 17 projects for homeless programs that got earmarked. The other thing you see when I looked through the list is I didn't recognize too many of the organizations that were getting grants. And so it's not necessarily, it's looking at projects also where people are connected to their member of Congress, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the projects that are the most needed or the most effective organizations. So it's not as rigorous, I guess, a process as the normal grant-making process is. It's really a little bit of payola going on there.
And I did read we have several California affordable housing developments that did receive earmarks. Anyone in this room successfully navigate an earmark? Yes, couple in back.
Yes, that's Santa Barbara County, a RAD project that has a large community center with health and wellness. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, could you repeat, please?
Yeah, hi, Santa Barbara County Housing Authority, and we did a RAD project, and our congressperson was willing to put it in. It's called Escalante Meadows in the city of Guadalupe. And we're doing a large community center that is health and wellness services and early childhood education for the community as well as for our residents. And then tearing down 52 cinder block public housing units, building 80 LIHTC units. We're in for the 9% round this round. And the congressman was just all over it. It's a low-income community. They don't get a lot of attention. They don't get a lot of money. And they can't keep a clinic open all the time. So they were really all for it. So we were really pleased. We were pleasantly surprised. But yes, we were successful.
That's a great story. Could you pass the mic just to your left? I think the woman on the end had another addition.
City of Hayward in Alameda County, we received an earmark to purchase some capital infrastructure on a housing navigation center, a transitional housing center for the city to purchase all the buildings there.
That's great. And I believe, you guys correct me, I think the earmark applications are due now.
Yeah.
That's what I've been reading. That now is the time to get your requests in. There's actually a formal process with new forms that are available. Are they posted on anyone's website? Sarah, are they on your website?
So each member of Congress will have their own form that you'll use, and the deadlines are coming up, but it's part of the broader deadlines that are in place for the FY23 process as well. We'll talk a little bit later about the president's FY23 budget requests, but House and Senate are starting to collect those appropriations requests from members of Congress. In the House, the deadline to the committee is April 29th for housing programs. It's May 13th in the Senate, but each office sets their own deadline, so you won't be in touch with them sooner than that. Don't wait to the last minute for that.
Right. So if you think you have an eligible project, development of some kind, and you haven't already reached out to your member of Congress, you should do that right after this session, unless you're having lunch, because we do if they're going to be earmarks, we want them to go to all of you in this room, as opposed to other uses, given the extraordinary need we have in the state, and the still short of resources. So I'm going to just pivot. Nan, from a homelessness perspective, how do you rate the spending package that was just approved?
Well, I think we got an increase in homeless assistance, so that was good, significant increase. One thing I wanted to mention, though, was something that seems to be happening around permanent supportive housing beds. Basically, the permanent supportive housing beds for the past couple of years have really not been keeping up with the growth of chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness is going up about 8,000 households per year, while the incremental PSH beds are going up only around 5,000. So in effect, we're housing fewer people with permanent supportive housing than we're losing ground, and a lot of those are people that are unsheltered. There are a lot of also people who have really needs for permanent supportive housing beds, but who aren't chronically homeless, essentially because they don't meet the chronicity requirement. They just haven't been homeless as long, but they have more serious problems. We have a growing elderly population. We have a lot of people with very serious needs that aren't getting prioritized for permanent supportive housing because chronic homelessness is the priority definition. So that's something that we're working with HUD and other agencies on. But I think that we really need to increase the funding for permanent supportive housing as we move forward on this through the appropriations process.
Thank you. Luca, quick take on 2022 budget or spending?
I think they covered most of
They
it.
covered it,
yeah.
okay. Thank you. I'm going to just pause. Questions about, again, we're doing this in buckets. The spending bill that was just approved last month, and I realized talking to Karen Flock at Ventura Housing Authority that you haven't even seen the resources yet. You don't know how many vouchers you're getting. But other than that, are there any questions that the panelists did not yet answer that you would like to hear answered about the spending bill? All right, then we are going to continue on to the coming spending bill. And this one is, at least initially, pretty exciting, the way this administration came out of the gate. And Sarah, why don't you just remind us about, and you started talking about the timing, but how is this going to play out? We have the administration releasing their proposal, and then walk us through.
Yeah, so the president released his budget request last week of March. Now that it's out, the House and Senate can start their processes, and like all presidential budget requests, Congress will ignore this one too, but they might use it as a guidepost for where they might want to go. We've heard that, I mentioned before, that the House deadline is the end of the month, April 29th, May 13th in the Senate. After that point, you'll start to see those committees start to draft their bills and move it along in the process. And we've heard that the Senate chair and ranking member, Leahy and Shelby, who are retiring at the end of this year, want to see something move much more quickly than last year. You know, we were very disappointed to see a CR that pushed us all the way into March.
CR being?
A continuing resolution that just kept the prior year's funding levels while keeping the government open while they make decisions about spending in a formal bill. They want to move the process along more quickly, but I think there's a lot of skepticism about whether or not that will happen, especially if we see Republicans take over the House like they're projected to. Maybe they'll even take over the Senate. You can imagine if you're an incoming Republican member of Congress, you're going to want to punt decisions on a spending bill until you have an ability to influence that. We often see that, not all the time, but sometimes we see that play out. And so we're preparing now for another continuing resolution, at least from October 1 when the fiscal year starts. We'll probably see one towards the end of the year, November, December. But there's a big question about whether or not we see another CR that pushes us back into the new year.
All right, and just big picture, I know you said that this proposal isn't going to get enacted as it came out of the White House, but in terms of the markers they set out, what jumps out to you as most important?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another second year of a really strong presidential proposal. It's about $12 billion more than FY21, about $6 billion more than the prior year. And you see a lot of that funding focused on addressing some of the underlying causes of the housing crisis and to address homelessness. So we saw another proposal for 200,000 vouchers from the president, and also really significant increases in public housing capital, the home program, and homelessness assistance grants. So about an 11% increase for homelessness funds, 10% increase for public housing capital, and a huge 30% increase for the home program. And I think that is aligned with what we've been seeing from the administration overall about this focus on supply and how they can help address that.
And I'd just say that RAD got $100 million for the first time, right? We got Karen Flock in the audience. So that was new for FY23. And I just point out, Peter, I know you're going to talk about the supply, but I just, do you want to?
Sure. I'm happy to have your comments too, Luke. But I think it is a good sign, as much as I don't think the proposals, there's three main proposals on housing supply that were in the budget. That's not a part of the usual sort of budget process, spending process. And that is, there's a housing supply fund at HUD. That's $35 billion. $25 billion would be for financing tools to state and local housing finance agencies, and another $10 billion for essentially infrastructure grants associated with housing. There's a $5 billion program at Treasury in the CDFI fund that would go to CDFIs for financing tools for putting forward the affordable housing activities. It's not too dissimilar from the Capital Magnet Fund, except that there's no sort of 10-to-1 leverage requirement associated with this proposal, as far as we know. They haven't fully fleshed out all the details yet. And then there's a $7.9 billion increase in the low-income housing tax credit. And this proposal, in essence, takes one of the 24 or so proposals from the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which has been the long-standing legislation that has been pending in Congress for several years, and it's been the menu from which Congress has been taking whenever they have an opportunity to move legislation. And so it was good to see the administration take from that menu itself and say, yeah, we think that a proposal to allow state agencies to provide basis boosts for bonds financed properties, regardless of location, outside of difficult development areas and qualified census tracts. The only sort of small tweak to that from the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act is the proposal that you would have to have either be financing new construction or a substantial rehabilitation that had a net increase in units. So RAD often has, especially the sort of RAD to Faircloth process that some of you may be aware of, where you're essentially able to finance new public housing units as long as your PHA is under their so-called limit they had, Faircloth limit, established in 1999, which many PHAs do. They are under their Faircloth limits. So that's one way that I think that is envisioning taking advantage of that proposal.
Just
go
more
ahead, Lynn.
generally, it's encouraging to see the Housing Supply Fund. One of the arguments that NHC and our coalition partners have been making is we have a supply-demand mismatch. And we obviously have inflation, and one of the ways we can address inflation is through more housing supply. That's one of the arguments we've been making to staffers. So it's encouraging to see the administration kind of put, we'll see how it shakes out, but at least put a marker in the sand for housing supply. They recognize it as important.
So speaking of housing supply, this is a quiz. Peter, what's the #1 issue for people producing affordable homes, rental homes in California that we want out of Congress?
The 25% test.
Right, lowering the 50% test so we can get more tax-exempt bond capacity. And why didn't that make it into this Biden proposal?
It wasn't something specifically against that particular proposal. If you look throughout their fiscal year 2023 budget request, there were no specifics on what had previously been a part of the Build Back Better or their previous budget request in fiscal year 2022. So it wasn't that the administration was saying, well, this is no longer a priority. They sort of said, we didn't want to disrupt the ongoing negotiations, we'll talk about this more later, on that reconciliation bill. So we just decided to punt on the issue entirely. There's something called a deficit neutral fund, which basically says, if Congress does pass a reconciliation bill, this budget anticipates it and is able to accommodate it. But so I don't think they are no longer, I believe the administration still views this as a priority. They just are putting it in two different buckets. There's the reconciliation bucket, and then there's the future bucket. And the housing supply fund, the CDFI Affordable Housing Supply Fund, and the basis boost for bond finances are part of that future bucket.
Thanks for addressing that. We're going to come back to that advocacy priority. Nan, from a homelessness perspective, how do you view the markers in this administration budget?
Well, I think first of all, in terms of needs, I hope that we're wrong, but we're really expecting to see homelessness go up in the next year. It typically does go up after a recession or something like the pandemic. It's a lagging indicator, so it doesn't go up right away. So I would say probably summer, fall. The other thing that's happening is there actually have been some significant decreases in homelessness, especially among families with children, also among veterans. A lot of that probably during the pandemic period, a lot of that probably has to do with the child tax credit and other tax credits, the unemployment boost, eviction moratoria, all of that's going away. So we expect, sadly, to see the need for homeless assistance from the federal government to be going up. As Sarah mentioned, we did get an increase of $360 million for the homeless assistance funds. That's good, but probably not going to be enough to fill very many gaps there. The other thing to keep an eye on is a lot of housing money running through VA for homeless people. There's the HUD-VASH program. That didn't actually they didn't actually ask for additional funds. That's a long story, so won't get into that. But what they did do was they increased the SSVF, Supportive Services for Veteran Families program. They doubled the size of that. That the program, for those of you who are not familiar, is not for supportive services for homeless families. It's for housing, largely for single veterans. But anyway, that went up from $365 to $730 million. And the additional funds, although it's not in the proposal, we believe are meant to be used for a housing subsidy that VA is trying through the SSVF program, which is that they will pay 50% of someone's rent, for a veteran's rent, homeless veteran's rent, for up to 2 years, and that can then be renewed. So it's a different agency than we're used to working with, but there's a lot of, as I say, housing money running through the VA.
Great, thank you. So just kind of summarizing what I think I'm hearing from you all, the administration's proposing pretty significant increases, mostly across the board on HUD programs, and we didn't really talk about discretionary versus mandatory. Who wants to speak on that point? Because that feels like something different in this proposal.
Right, well, there's an important aspect of in terms of how the programs worked for you all, it seems similar, but there's a very important difference in terms of how Congress looks at it, because, discretionary, there's a fixed budget, and you have to fit in that fixed budget. With a mandatory spending, if Congress passes it, then it exists outside of this process. And, to the extent that Congress decides to do it, it can, can prove that. But the problem, of course, with mandatory is that it's often a higher bar to be able to get such proposals passed. It's not very common that every year Congress passes a new mandatory spending proposal.
So the $35 billion for supply is proposed to be mandatory, that is included in the baseline federal budget and not needing to go through the normal committee markup process. if Congress were to agree.
Right, and it's a different committee as well. So although the banking committees in Congress, often try to influence the appropriations process, and ultimately, in the end, it's the appropriations committees that decide how much money goes into these various buckets for the discretionary budget. But for the mandatory spending programs, it's entirely the purview of the banking committees. If they decide to do it and they pass it, and it has to go through the special process where there's a pay-as-you-go rule. You have to make sure that it's offset with either reduced spending elsewhere or revenue increases. And as long as you go through that whole process and you get 60 votes in the Senate, or, of course, this reconciliation, which is the alternate process there for what we're seeing on the bill formerly known as Build Back Better. But it will be a challenge to address new mandatory spendings in yet another reconciliation bill when they haven't even finished the existing pending one from the last fiscal year. So I think it's great to, again, I want to emphasize, it's great to see the administration making it a priority and saying this should be a mandatory program. We shouldn't have to have this fight against all the various other housing programs out there that are also very important. It should be something separate, additional on top of this. But that those proposals have an uncertain future. They don't fit into this regular process.
Given the interconnectedness between the 2023 President's budget proposal and formerly known Build Back Better, I actually want us to segue there and then come back and take questions on all of it. So just to begin, if we're not going to call this Build Back Better anymore, if that was last year's name, then Peter, you suggested at breakfast this morning we should be thinking about this as the technical term budget reconciliation bill. Can you explain, please, what budget reconciliation means and why it's significant?
So, I mean, as I think we've talked in the past, budget reconciliation is a special process that Congress set up to allow for proposals to advance essentially through the Senate with 50 votes. And there are very special
So
rules.
simple majority.
Simple majority in the Senate, which makes a huge difference because it's often very difficult to get 60 senators to vote for anything. And so having that expedited process is a valuable tool. And that's why, as we're going to talk about it, the existing pending reconciliation bill from the last fiscal year is too important to let go away entirely because they're so rarely come down the pike. And they've already sort of, I think, they've got a lot of priorities that really depend on this reconciliation route in order to be able to go forward. So, as a quick recap, I'm sure many of you have been following this, but just to level set here, Congress last summer passed a budget resolution for fiscal year 2022, and that unlocked the process. The House went forward and started off with a fairly ambitious, $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill that they called the Build Back Better Act. As the House began to sort of think about this and saw that there was resistance in the Senate, it got whittled down to essentially $2.2 trillion all told. And that did pass just before Thanksgiving. And then it was heading to the Senate, and the Senate was pending in the Senate when Manchin made his famous statement on December 19th, essentially bring everything to a screeching halt. But since the State of the Union address that President Biden had, there's been talk again of resurrecting a smaller bill, not exactly sure how small, but a smaller one. And that we do anticipate those negotiations to heat up once Congress comes back from its Easter recess. This week is Supreme Court nomination week. Last night they had a few procedural votes, and there's anticipation of final confirmation at the end of the week. And they then, both House and Senate, go home for the Easter recess. They come back on April 25th, and that's when this sort of next, what they call work period, from April 25th until Memorial Day, is we see as a crucial period where they start really getting serious on restarting those negotiations on a smaller bill.
Okay, so that's the overview of reconciliation. Sarah, what is National Income Housing Coalition hoping for from this slimmed down? Luke, did you want to
No, can I
add
just say,
something?
you know, one piece of this great overview. Senator Manchin, throughout the entire process, was saying, what, 1.5? He gave his...
Back in July.
Back in July. So I think he's been fairly consistent in terms of where he stands. And I think that's important to keep in mind as...
Although I don't think 1.5 is really on the table anymore, and I think the reason for that is that since July, inflation has really kicked up a few notches. But how much lower than 1.5? Your guess is as good as mine.
And will
We
it
don't
include
know.
housing?
Right,
Well,
the higher the better for housing.
We actually want you guys to guess. That's why you're here. So don't hold back.
So in terms of what's possible, I completely agree with Peter's overview of where things are. What we have is what's in the House bill as a starting point. It's $150 billion plus. Really significant funding increases for programs that are targeted to people who have the very greatest needs. We have $25 billion to expand vouchers to another 300,000 households. We have $65 billion to preserve public housing for about 2.5 million residents. $15 billion to build another 150,000 units of housing through the National Housing Trust Fund. Lots of other resources that are in the bill too. And I think the framework that we're seeing is going to be a lot smaller, which means that we're going to have to advocate a lot more effectively and consistently if we want to make sure that housing stays in that final package. Manchin has also has created his own framework of what he's looking at through raising revenue through tax increases on the wealthy, by having savings through drug negotiations on Medicare, Medicaid, and then to split the money between deficit reduction and spending. And if you're splitting that money in half, it already means, right, the pie is a lot smaller. We're seeing congressional leaders sort of tamp down expectations, trying to send signals to folks that they're not going to get everything that they asked for, and that they're going to be forced to make really tough decisions about what makes it into a final bill. But I think that we have a really good chance of keeping housing to some extent, maybe not at the same funding levels as before, but keeping housing in this budget reconciliation bill. And in part, that's because the framework that Manchin has been using, the framework that the White House has been using, is all around how do we address inflation. And we know that housing is a primary driver of inflation. And so the more we're talking about how we can assist people's household expenses by bringing down their housing costs, whether it's through vouchers or building more supply, that seems like the strongest argument that we have going forward. So there's still an opportunity, but it really depends on the work that all of us are doing collectively to be loud and consistent and engaging with our members of Congress, because if we stop putting the gas on the pedal and we pull back on our advocacy, that's the surest way we have to make sure that housing doesn't stay in the package. So I want to thank you for all of the advocacy you've done so far. That's the reason why we saw a House bill with really significant numbers, but we have to keep that pressure up, especially between now and I'd say July. We've heard Manchin, there's a rumor Manchin was looking at July as a final sort of deadline, pivot point. So between now and the next couple of months, this is really critical for all of you guys to be weighing in with your members of Congress, putting pressure there to make sure that when Democrats are deciding among the various priorities that they have, what's most important, that housing rises to the top.
If I could just jump into why July too, I mean, I think, and I didn't go over this in my overview, I did mention that there's this next work period from Memorial Day, from April 25th to Memorial Day. There's another one from Memorial Day to 4th of July. And then there's one last one before the long August recess. And that is really, I think, for all intents and purposes, the real deadline. If they don't have it done before the August recess, then I think the chances of getting something done are extremely low. They come back from the August recess, they've got to keep the federal government running, and then the election beckons. They leave at the end of the month of September. It's going to be a very tough election. There's going to be a lot of pressure that members will be to focus on campaigning at home. And it's doing a huge, ambitious piece of legislation in that context is just, I think, too much to ask. So that's why I think you got to view these next sort of 3 distinct periods as they've got to make some advancement in the first one, and then maybe take up that further advancement and either get it done in the second, or as the backup, in case break glass, here's that last one from 4th of July to the August recess that we have as our opportunity.
And there have been a lot of things coming up they're keeping Congress preoccupied, really important things. Luke, from the National Housing Conference perspective, how do you guys see the path towards the next version of a Build Back Better with some significant housing investments in it?
Yeah, I think the path goes through Senator Manchin, right? And that's exactly what Sarah said, and I would echo her sentiments there. I would also say that, we've had several conversations with Senator Manchin's staff over the course of a few months, and late last year and early this year, and, they've been, I would say supportive of the housing provisions. They are big users of the home program. I think it's an important note as well that, West Virginia has, I think, something absurd, like an 80% home ownership rate. So their issue in housing is not necessarily a rental issue, it's a quality of housing. And, that's, Neighborhood Homes Investment Act speaks to that.
You want to say what that is, by the way? I'm not
Sorry?
sure. Do you want to explain what the neighborhood homes?
Yeah. So the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, it's a bipartisan bill introduced in the Senate by Senator Cardin and Higgins, Portman, and then in the House, I think it's Representative Higgins.
Kelly.
And Kelly. And essentially what the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act does is it provides tax credits to shore up the difference in what we call the appraisal gap. So in some communities, even here in California, but certainly in the Rust Belt, essentially, the price to rehab a home exceeds its market value. And so therefore, developers won't touch it. And so what the Neighborhood Homes Investment Tax Credits will do is provide a tax credit to bridge the appraisal gap. The eligible census tracts are, 63% of the eligible census tracts are majority minority, so we do see a racial equity component to it. I think of neighborhood homes as like a life tech for single family homes, right? Which produces home ownership in the process. So it's ideas like that that, when we've spoken to Senator Manchin's staff, thinking through kind of the inflation side of things, we've also heard from our members in West Virginia that, he's been fed a steady diet of misinformation about voucher utilization in West Virginia. And so being able to make the argument to him that there is actually a need in West Virginia because his folks on the ground are telling him, we have a utilization rate and we're having to give back vouchers. So we've been making the argument that that's not necessarily the case. So in terms of a path forward, I think it goes through West Virginia. I think we think about, housing supply and targeted demand side policies as well. So I think that there's been a narrative around, can we advocate for demand side policies? Will it increase inflation? And I think our response as an organization, and I think, shared amongst our partners, is targeted demand side is also, it won't have an impact on inflation, right? There are communities where you need to have targeted investments because the housing in those areas is actually deflated. So you need to be able to provide demand side policies and supply side policies that will.
Look, just to make sure we're all following this, so a demand side policy would be a voucher.
A voucher,
for example,
exactly, yeah.
Or possibly a tax credit that could be transferred or moved around in some way.
Or a down payment
Yeah.
assistance. That was in Build Back Better, and that was a key
Right.
policy priority for the National Housing Conference. Yeah.
Got it. Nan, anything you want to add before I go to questions?
No, not really, except to say that obviously we need to do a better job of informing Senator Manchin's office about the number of homeless people in West Virginia if they're having difficulty getting rid of their vouchers.
Yeah, that's pretty shocking that would be
Yeah.
the story that he's getting told. Sarah, go
But
ahead.
I just want to pause and say, you don't live in West Virginia. You might be saying, well, what can I do about that? And the truth is that Manchin's one party who's going to be in the negotiations, but so are potentially House and Senate leadership in the White House, right? Some combination. And you have a direct access to Speaker Pelosi, who is going to be highly influential in these final negotiations. You also have Chairwoman Waters, who leads the Financial Services Committee, who's been fighting very hard and working hand in glove with Senator Schumer and Senator Brown to make sure housing remains in the package. So you have people at your disposal right now who are key players, and you don't want to waste that opportunity. So continue to engage with them and put pressure on them to make sure that when they're in the negotiating room, that they're making as hard of a push as possible for housing.
If I could add to your list, Sarah, of course, there are 5 Californians on the Ways and Means Committee, heading with Mike Thompson from Napa, extraordinarily influential, in addition to Speaker Pelosi. And I feel duty-bound. I think I said this last year at the virtual conference. We have like one more year of Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, likely. I mean, she hasn't announced this officially yet, but it's the going, I think, supposition that this will be her last year, and you don't want to waste that level of influence. You can't underscore how influential it is to have, a speaker in this process when we have like one reconciliation bill and 1 year left of Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. You just can't, I think, underestimate the preciousness of this opportunity.
It's a great reminder. And as you've pointed out numerous times, every California member of Congress also has access to the Speaker. So even if you don't live in the Speaker's district, which most of us don't, you still can make your pitch to your own member of Congress to please elevate this with the Speaker. And that tends to be a good way to go. So now we're going to give you all, I know some of this has been pretty technical, but this is your chance to ask questions about future spending opportunities coming up that you're interested in. So anyone want to be brave and start with a question? Okay, hold on one second. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Sheila. I'm from Kings County Human Services in Hampton, California. I just had a quick question about the earmarker process, if you guys could go through that, or if the 2 counties in the back could elaborate more on how they went through that process.
So I have a suggestion on that one. There's actually some pretty good documentation. And if you will leave your card with me or Christina, I can make sure to get it to you, or Sarah can get it to you from the coalition, because there's about 4 documents that explain it. Helmi, go ahead.
Good afternoon, I guess. I'm Helmi Hisserick, and I work with LaSar Development Consulting. The question I have actually is probably best for Nan Roman. Nice to see you. In Los Angeles, the health department has converted health funding to flexible housing subsidies. And I'm just curious to know if there's any discussion at the national level of using alternative sources for vouchers.
There's endless discussion at the national level about using health resources to pay for people's housing, since the health sector is the winner when people get housed. The cost is to the housing side, the savings are to the health side. So there's a lot of discussion about that. On the other hand, generally speaking, across administrations, HHS has really puts a stopper on most suggestions to be able to use healthcare resources to fund housing directly. So, but I think it's a continuing thing. There are obviously some states, it's a state-by-state thing in terms of healthcare, in which they figured out ways to get direct housing money from their health departments.
Yeah, I'll just add, Helmi, I think flexible housing subsidy pool is a fantastic model. And I'm really hoping that, it's not easy financially, as we've seen, to maintain, but while you're at the city working with your counterparts at the county, I think it housed a huge number of people. So I would like us all to elevate that to a state level and ask for state support for the programs. And then eventually let's get Congress to support it, because I agree with you. I think it's fantastic. Question over here.
Good morning. Patrick Odolini from Swinnerton Builders. I'm our Affordable Housing Director. And first of all, thank you for your time this morning. Really great information. In California, we use density bonus tools a lot lately, and it's a really great thing to make a lot of these projects pencil. I'm under no illusion that there's going to be like a federal density bonus or anything like that, but I'm wondering what the conversation is like at that level. Are they talking about it in terms of viable tools in a sense to build more units faster?
Who wants to take that one?
That actually just, go ahead, Peter.
There isn't something, again, specifically density bonus related, but as part of the Housing Supply Fund and as part of administration discussions, there has been an acknowledgement that zoning and land use practices have a huge impact on affordable housing. And so they've been trying to find, actually, one of the pots of money in the Build Back Better spending would be for grants that would go to state and local governments to help reform their zoning and land use policies. And this housing supply fund, that would be one sort of eligible use of that $35 billion mandatory program. So there's certainly discussions, but I think the challenge always has been that land use and zoning practices are fairly, local government driven decisions, and maybe to a lesser extent state government. The federal government has very little role in this. And the few times that there's been an attempt to do this on a more of a stick method, like with holding HUD or transportation funds, it runs into a lot of opposition in Congress. So it's been a sort of a challenge to effectuate that as a federal policy.
Luke?
I'll be sure. Unlocking Possibilities, I think, was the act in Build Back Better, if you're interested. In our conversations with the administration about this, obviously, local zoning is, as you all are very familiar with, is an issue. I think what we've heard from the administration is, what we asked, what's the federal role? And, as Peter's describing, it's to provide incentives for local jurisdictions that recognize the importance of zoning reform and being able to provide technical assistance and funding at the local level in order to address zoning. And I think that's what was codified in Unlocking Possibilities, and I think that's generally how the administration thinks about it.
I just wanted to say, I think one of the things to be aware of, we support reducing zoning barriers and land use restrictions as well. It has to be a part of the menu of options that are being used. But one of the things that we've seen is an increase, especially among House Republicans, saying California needs to figure out its zoning first before we give it more money. Or all we need to do is address zoning and the problem will be taken care of. And neither of those are true or real. And so just to flag it for all of you that when you're engaging with your members of Congress, it's important to talk about why zoning changes are helpful and important and necessary, but also what the limits of that are and why we also need the federal government to be a partner to local governments by providing resources, especially when it comes to building housing for people with the very lowest incomes who won't necessarily be served by new housing that's built because of zoning changes.
Great, thank you for those answers and for the question. We have another question. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Chris Davidson. I'm with City Data Services. And my question is, are there any green components that's attached into any of this funding, or does that fall on the local and state and jurisdictions?
Who wants to field that one? Peter.
So let me start with the reconciliation bill, formerly known as Build Back Better. There's actually a very significant proposal that would allow you to combine solar panels financed by the Renewable Energy Investment Tax Credit with housing credit properties and not have to reduce eligible basis. This has been one of the key problems. You can theoretically, still do under current law the combining of those resources to make the properties greener, but it's very difficult, and it's sort of a zero-sum game. If you get some from the ITC, but you have to give it back in the low-income housing tax credit, then to go through the whole process can be a real challenge. So that would really, we believe, would be a huge benefit. Plus, in addition to that, they're establishing a 20% bonus for the ITC when it's used in conjunction with affordable housing. So the combination of those two policies, basically, I think the sort of my little headline for this would be, you'd have to ask yourself, why wouldn't you put solar panels on every single bond financed property in the state of California? Because it almost pays for itself entirely when you combine all the various different aspects here. So that's one really exciting possibility. And I'd say, if we're looking at, the possibilities of what actually emerges in the reconciliation bill, I'd say this is probably near the top, because the green, this is something that Senator Manchin himself has said, it's a priority. I want to include, green tax incentives in this package, and this is tucked in there nicely. It's very obscured. It's not got a huge target sign on it, even though it could be really, really powerful included on that. So I think that on the federal level, that's one of the key new green resources we're looking at.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Martinez with Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. Good to see everybody. Political question. I heard Senator Manchin's name a lot, and I'm just curious. By the way, the whole discussion took me back to fall of last year when we were reaching out to a lot of the California leaders that you mentioned and encouraging our members to do the same. I'm just wondering if Senator Sinema is also someone who can gum things up or maybe clear out a bottleneck. Just heard Manchin's name a lot. I'm wondering if she might play a role as well. Thanks.
I can
think
take it unless you want to
let
go
Sarah
first.
go.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the latest we've heard, there was always concern about Sinema also and Manchin, but in the last couple of months leading up to when they made a big push in December, we had heard that Sinema had gotten on board and was less of a problem than Manchin is. So I think it comes down to one man right now. But Sinema it's always important to keep up advocacy in those states to make sure we don't see any backsliding, but as of right now, it seems like less of a concern.
I have one little tweak to that, though, Sarah, and that is, it has been a little bit of a Jenga game because, sometimes you have a situation where Manchin will say, this is one something I'm really for, but then, Sinema will say, no, I can't, I'm not up for that. And one great example of this is raising the corporate tax rate to 25%. That's something that's got broad support amongst, Senate Democrats, and Senator Manchin himself. He's all in favor of that. But that's been held up because Senator Sinema says no. And given when you've got the 50-50 Senate, you can't lose a single senator. So there's been a few things where Senator Sinema has essentially drawn her red lines and has stopped things. And in this new negotiation round, you don't know what Manchin will say in terms of, here's one other thing I want for this new package, and how Sinema's problems might present an obstacle there. But I will agree in general that Manchin has been the bigger problem than Sinema has been.
I think we're going to now pivot to non-funding, at least non-funding appropriations, and that is the regulatory and administrative initiatives coming out of Washington. And to kick us off, at this moment, Community Reinvestment Act, Federal Community Reinvestment Act is even more important to us than it ever has been before. Anyone who's got a property looking for a low-income housing tax credit investor is well aware of that. We're very dependent on that act. And of course, we had a scare in the last administration with a rollback with very little notice of the regulations. Things have improved, but Luke, why don't you kick us off? Tell us, where are we with the Biden administration and the Community Reinvestment Act?
We're hearing that it could come out in a couple weeks, a unified rule.
A new updated rule.
A new updated rule, yeah. Not an updated rule, an NPR in a couple weeks. That's what we're hearing.
Which is?
Notice of proposed rulemaking.
Thank
Yes.
you. Notice of proposed rulemaking. This sounds very exciting, Luke.
Yes, it's the alphabet soup, right? Yeah, so, I'm not sure how much folks know about what's going on with unified rulemaking. So, just very high level, you have three prudential regulators, the FDIC, the Federal Reserve Board, and the OCC, the Office of Control of the Currency. They regulate the banks, and I think the OCC regulates something like 70% of national banking assets. Basically, if you have an NA in your name, you're probably regulated by the OCC. For California audience, the Federal Reserve Board, they regulate the state chartered banks. And so we are excited about the prospect of a unified rulemaking. That means all three prudential regulators will be operating from the same rule, off the same rule.
Which
would
was
create-
not true during the Trump era, right?
Which was not true during the Trump era, no, that's, yes. And we're excited about the idea of not only getting them together, but also an update to CRA. I mean, the last time we saw an update to CRA was 1995 in the Clinton administration. And so since then, banks have changed dramatically. Assessment areas, I mean, there's a whole list of things we can get into if your audience is interested.
I
but-
think the geographic areas are important to this group here. I'm recognizing at least a few people who don't work in just downtown, in the Inner Bay Area or Los Angeles or San Diego. And if you're not in those top CRA markets, it occasionally has been hard to get a lender or investor who's motivated by Community Reinvestment Act. I think there are probably some war stories in this room. So that is of interest to folks if you have a direction that's heading in.
I would say, then maybe just a couple more general comments. Banks are not, they're not punished for meeting their CRA obligations, but if they want something from their regulator.
Like an approval
like
for
an
US
approval
Bank to purchase Union Bank, for
Yeah,
example?
if there's an acquisition or a merger, if you need something from your regulator and you are not meeting your CRA obligations, you're gonna have a very hard time. So there is incentive for banks to meet their CRA obligations. And I would just say there's a few things that we are watching for within within unified rulemaking. CRA was initially passed in 1977 to address systemic racism coming out of the federal government, redlining and historic disinvestment, predominantly impacting communities of color. And yet we've never seen race be used as a measurement for CRA. And so as an organization, we're saying that now is a time to be thinking about your approvals, your loan purchases. How do you ensure that CRA is used as a tool to make sure that we can truly reconcile the historic wrongs in our country? And so CRA needs to take race into account. Right now they use LMI, low middle income income, as a proxy for race. What we know, in fact, Urban Institute I haven't read it yet, but they released a blog this morning on it. LMI is not a good proxy for race. In fact, there's a majority white people that live in this definition. And so we need to be thinking about what ways in which we can put pressure on the regulators, really, to take race into account. And then performance contexts, we're looking at assessment areas. There's a number of things in terms of unified rulemaking that needs to be updated in 2022.
And if I can just elaborate, Luke, one of the key things that Matt was hinting out about the differences between downtown San Francisco, LA, versus Sacramento or Fresno or whatever, as the case may be, is that traditionally CRA has been essentially evaluated. What are you doing where your bank deposits are? And that made sense in 1977 because where your bank deposits were generally where you lended and where you did your banking activities. But now in 2022, we have internet banks and lending is all over the place. It's not really affected by where your branches are, where your deposits are. And you also have some sort of weird situations where, like, if you have institutional deposits in a bank in San Francisco, doesn't mean all of a sudden that there's all these more people in San Francisco that need to be served via CRA. Not to say that CRA, there's challenges in San Francisco, so obviously there are, but the whole point of having it based purely on deposits doesn't make sense. And so I think the concept, what we're hoping that we can do in this rulemaking process is to sort of try to, detach the deposit taking necessarily as part of the evaluation and say, if you have, a very good investment in the state of California, it shouldn't matter you don't have deposits there. You should get, credit from the bank for that investment. And that way, I don't think this has to be a zero-sum game. It's not about taking away from San Francisco and giving to Fresno. It's a way of making sure that banks give more and they invest more into Fresno and more into Sacramento. And I think if we do it right in this regulatory process and we engage, we can pull that off. I think it's absolutely possible we can do that.
And it's budget neutral, right? It's budget neutral as well. So this is a way for folks to advocate for things that, can have positive impacts in communities of color. That's not going to have an impact on the budget. And so I think that, especially in the conversation we just had, I think it's an important, tool that we have in our arsenal.
Any quick questions or comments on Community Reinvestment Act changes or needs for changes? Okay, we can come back if there are some. Nan, I want to get you back into the mix here. There's a debate that's going on nationally and that's going on in California that you're a big part of. And you and I were talking before this session about, previously all of us just pretty much embraced the housing first principle that everyone needs to get into a permanently affordable home as the best treatment option for people facing homelessness. And more recently, I think in California, we've been feeling overwhelmed, right? Especially as we're throttled back by the lack of tax and bond capacity. We can't see a way to keep up with the increases in homelessness with our production. So, and I know I don't want to put pressure on you to say anything you don't want to, but I know you had a meeting with Governor Newsom's housing czar earlier today about this topic. What advice would you have for us and thoughts would you have for us about this evolving topic?
Well, that's a lot. How to solve the housing problem in California. And I would say the conversation that I had with Jason Elliott this morning was about the care court. So I'll come back to that. I was really asking him some questions about the housing dimension of that. All the evidence, let me start with a little bit different thing than what you started with, which is to say that there's also a pushback going on nationally, and I think in California now too, around housing first as a principle or an important way to end homelessness. And the idea of housing first basically is nothing that anybody couldn't recognize, that people just do better if they have a safe place to live, a stable place to live, that they're not going to have to leave, and that they feel some agency over. And there's just a lot of evidence over 30 years of homelessness now that it makes a lot more sense to make sure people get housing at the front end. The services work so much better. If you try to give people the services at the front end, it doesn't work nearly so well. There's a lot of evidence that shows that. So one fight that's going on is there's a lot of antagonism toward homeless people. I think a lot of it coming since the pandemic, when people have been home, and there are a lot of people living on the street. People that have been living on the street before have moved into more visible places. We don't actually have any data that says that the number of unsheltered homeless people is going up very much in the past year. It's more maybe that they're visible, but there's tremendous antagonism toward them, although people feel sympathetic for them too. What they're really antagonistic about is they don't like to look at it. They don't like to see people in their neighborhoods. And we also feel we need to get those people into housing. But there's not an easy answer for how to get people into housing, because as you said, I mean, we're taking baby steps toward filling the supply gap of affordable housing. So what do? Well, I think, unfortunately, one of the things that we're going to need to do is we were talking about the fact that not that long ago, in the 70s, basically, there were enough affordable units for everybody who needed them. And we got rid of a lot of, we being liberal, I'll speak for myself maybe, people who felt that housing wasn't good enough, SRO housing wasn't good enough for people. And we got rid of a lot of units of affordable housing. And starting in the 80s, we had a deficit, and starting in the 80s, we got homeless people as well, because there just weren't enough units. And now we're 7 million units short, and we're not gonna, there's no way that we can fill that gap in the short run. So we have to figure out what to do with people in the short run while we're trying to fill that gap in affordable housing. And there's no magic solution to that, obviously, or we all would be doing it. But I do think, doing more housing sharing, looking at some of these models that we've rejected over time, unfortunately, that we probably need to go back to. There are various places around the country that are doing various kinds of things. There are also a lot, there's some people who are homeless who really don't want the responsibility of an apartment and want something simpler, a simpler way to live. There aren't easy things there. The discussion, but we, and there's a lot of strategic thinking that needs to be done about how much to invest in shelter, which I see happening a lot here and in other places too. That we should just invest a lot of money in shelter and get everyone into shelter versus housing, and what's the balance there? How do you balance those two things? Because, you have so many unsheltered people in California. You have the largest homeless population of any state in the country, and you have way higher percentage of unsheltered people. No one else is even close. I think you're in the 70s, 70%, over 70% of people unsheltered. So you can't just live with that either. So we're going to have to make some compromises there. One of the things the administration, the Newsom administration has proposed is this Care Accord initiative. And there are two pieces to that. One of them I'm not really qualified to speak about, which is the behavioral health part. We are at the Alliance working with Disability Rights California and Mental Health America California on the services side of things. But the other side of things is housing for people. And this Care Courts program is for, I'm sure you all know, is for people with very serious mental illness and substance abuse disorders. And it has the word court in it, and so that makes it a big issue in terms of mental health and people feeling that they're losing their agency or their decision-making authority, or they're being forced into treatment, which there are all kinds of issues are with. But the other side of it is that there was a housing plan is contemplated in this, but there is no other information about what the housing plan is. And I think they're talking about 10 to 15,000 people, something like that. And so even coming up with that number of units is a challenge. But what I would say to you all on the housing side is that I think what was explained to me today was that what was proposed really was a framework. It's not the whole solution. And I think that if you have ideas about how, putting aside the other parts of it about the behavioral health care, but just on the housing side, about what could be going on in terms of board and care homes, which I think there are a lot of vacancies in now, and other kinds of facilities that the behavioral health organizations also do support. If you have suggestions for the administration, I think they're open to them. That's the sense that I had, that they put out a framework and they got a lot of pushback on it, but that there might be good, sensible ways to approach the housing side of this, and this would be a very good time to be talking to them about that. Great, thank you. We are going to pivot again, because we have different interests in this room, from Care Court to a question that we received online from our friend Ken Triguero, CEO at People's Self-Help Housing. And the question is, Peter, is going to be to you, which is, hey, we need some help with this Internal Revenue Service lack of clear guidance on income averaging that's killing us and making it really difficult to have a mix of incomes from 0 to 80% in our low-income housing tax credit developments. Is there any hope for the practitioners who are trying to make this work?
Yeah, great question, and great question. And I'll say that just give a quick recap of where we are. Back in October of 2020, administration finally released proposed regulations. This was enacted in the fiscal year 2018 omnibus spending bill. When those proposed rules came out, they were a bit of a shock because they were a lot different from what we expected. I mean, we have a good expectation of how the two other existing minimum income set-asides work, with 40% of the units at 60% AMI or 20% of the units at 50. And we thought that IRS would come out with proposed rules that would sort of be similar to those. It's just that we have the wrinkle that instead of 40% of the units at 60 and 60 is the hard ceiling, it's an average of 60. And so we had this concept that, well, okay, that means you can have half of those be like at 80 and half at 40, and that would go forward, and that would be great. But when they put out those proposed regs, it was, I guess the simplest way to put it is there was a cliff test where all of a sudden one unit that suddenly violates this process, which, if you have one unit at 40 at 60 or 20 at 50, that doesn't invalidate the entire credits for the building, right? You have to correct that one, or you can have recapture on that one unit. That's not how these rules were set up. They said one unit out of compliance, boom, the entire credits of the property are gone. And that, of course, sent shockwaves. There was a public hearing in the IRS in March of last year, and it was remarkable that there was sort of a unanimous perspective on this across the spectrum from nonprofit developers and public housing agencies all the way to investors and syndicators. Everyone said, this is bad, this is not going to work. And so we believe that this sort of commentary has slowly been penetrating, and the IRS, especially with the new Biden administration coming in and saying, this is a priority, we need to actually get this thing done. And so we anticipate, and there was a sort of a filing a few weeks ago where they said, we anticipate sending out final regulations by July 1st. And we've been talking with Treasury on the status on this, and they actually thought that they might even have that out this month, a couple of months ago, but of course, they always sort of miss time these sort of things. It always takes longer than they think it's going to take. But I think it's a good chance because the National Council of State Housing Agencies have their big low-income housing tax credit conference at the end of June, and they're scheduled to appear in that, and they always want to be able to talk about something that is done rather than something that's not done. And so that often is a motivating, force to get that actually out and finalized. And we hope that there'll be some fixes. It may not have everything that we all want to make it more as flexible and as useful. Because again, the whole concept behind this, just to remind us, is that we can use the rents from the 60 to 80 to help underwrite and go deeper, below 40%. That's the promise of this approach, and hopefully, the input that the Treasury's received the final rules when they come out will reflect that.
So bottom line, Ken should be hopeful that by July, there could be some new guidance. Peter Lawrence said it here.
I think there's a good chance. Just don't expect that we'll get everything that we were asking for in the final regs. That's just my only caveat.
Okay, we're going to try to save a few minutes here, but Luke, a hot topic in California.
Yep.
Building materials.
Yes.
Costs through the roof.
Yes.
Supply chain problems. What are you all doing in DC, and is there any prospect of federal assistance to try to help construction move more smoothly out here?
Absolutely. I mean, you all are well aware of the supply chain for lumber and construction materials is just kind of, well, lumber has been more erratic, but everything else looks like a hockey stick. In fact, we had Habitat for Humanity. We were just in conversation with them. They had a project in Georgia, I think it was, that they built in 2018. I think the lumber package was $100,000. That same project was a template in 2022 that's north of $200,000 just for the lumber alone. And I mean, we've been talking to developers out here as well, and it's a real issue. So we've been putting pressure on the administration to do something around supply chains, specifically around opening up a conversation with the Canadians on Canadian softwood lumber. We also sent a letter, I think it was like summer of last year, asking for the administration to put together a task force and host a summit on this. And they have 4 supply chain task force that are being led by the Commerce. One of them is around building supply. We've been in regular contact with them. I'd say that they've been working on the I think America Competes bill, working its way through the Senate. And as of about a couple weeks ago, we were talking to our folks out there, and they are now redirecting their attention on the supply chain. We've had some off-the-record conversations with folks at the White House, the NEC, and the
National Economic Council.
National Economic Council, DPC, and National Security Council, actually, about what we can do in this space. There's not a lot I could talk about there, but I will say it is
Does that mean
a
it's classified?
I'd say that it is on their radar, and they are thinking about ways in which they can address this. We've made the case to them that we can have more funding for housing and housing trust fund or more home money, but if we can't get the material costs back to where they were pre-pandemic, we're going to see a bottleneck in production. If you're looking at, we had a project here in California, a 41 unit project that saw lumber increases of $400,000. It's not going to pencil. And so we need to figure out ways in which not only do we get the funding for housing supply, but also address some of the supply chain issues as well.
Thanks, Luke. We have a urgent question from Jane. You keep this a little short.
I just wondered how much of this is related to Trump tariffs
Trump tariffs.
and the fix if it is.
How much of supply chain problems are related to the Trump tariffs versus?
I can talk or you can talk.
Go ahead,
Lorraine.
you're the supply chain expert.
It's far from the expert. I'm a fly on the wall in the room, and my boss is definitely taking the lead over there. I'd say yes, that's definitely an issue with the lumber or the tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber. Absolutely an issue. I think it didn't help that the Biden administration continued it, and I think there was an increase as well on the tariffs late last year. They've since rolled back. The beginning of this year, I think it was, I forget the percentage, Peter, but I think it was like 11. I forget exactly, but they pulled back. So they are. I think that they're trending in the right direction, but I think the bottom line is there needs to be some type of conversation with Catherine Tai about what we can do to get the Canadians involved. We're hearing that there's interest on the Canadian side, but we got to put pressure on the Biden administration to, at least signal that they're open to this conversation.
Okay, thank you. We are going to close with this live, exciting session where you're going to get to watch me type the brilliant ideas, the advocacy ideas from our panel. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists in 30 seconds or less to talk about one short-term advocacy priority, thinking as a Californian, for each of us to try between now and, say, July, using Peter's time frame. And then another advocacy priority for us for, let's say, realistically after the midterm elections. So November, December. So who wants to go first? Sarah, we're all looking at you.
I think the two most important things that you guys could be advocating for is to make sure that housing stays in any budget reconciliation bill that moves forward, and to not let up the pressure around that, and then to make sure that we get the highest level of funding possible and a spending bill. We really see those are the only major two avenues I see for getting more resources for housing, and so we want to make sure that we're on top of that and not letting up the pressure there. And then in terms of lame duck, I think it sort of depends on whether or not other things get done between now and July. There might be a lot of pressure after the election when Democrats lose the House to try to do whatever they can do in that short window of time before they lose power. So we'll have to check back in again to see what's happening at that time. But for now, those two issues.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to go next?
Well, I can go next because it's very similar what Sarah said, but just adding to that to try to ensure that that the housing resources are targeted to the people with greatest needs, because when we haven't talked too much about it, but one of the things that really has been happening is that there's a lot of money out there, but it's really not going to the people with the unsheltered homeless people, for example, people with the highest needs.
Can I go next, Luke? Sorry. I apologize. My back is giving out on me. Sorry. My apologies. I would say for the near term, the reconciliation bill, 25% test, 25% test, 25% test. Every single Californian, you need to, I would say, a member of the delegation, you need to reach out to them and remind them how important this is to California. And there's sort of two main ways you can do that. One, you can say, please communicate your strong preference to Speaker Pelosi. And two, there's the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act out there. There's actually a number of Californians who co-sponsored in the last Congress who are not yet on, some of them are on a queue, so this is a little complicated because they're trying to have a little bit of balance here issue, and that's not too heavily Democratic heavy. But there are no ones that aren't on the queue and haven't yet, and that's the key way you can show publicly I am supportive of the 25% test, is by getting to being a co-sponsor of that bill. Helps drive the momentum. So I would say that. And then if all else fails, and we're in a lame duck situation, there's always tax extenders. And there's the 12.5% allocation increase. It's a tax extender. We might be able to leverage a mini small 25% test bump in that. We'll just have to see.
Great, thank you. I was looking over at Frank Martinez because Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing has done a fantastic job with outreach to members of Congress in Southern California, signing up to co-sponsor, among other things. And I know others in this room have worked hard at that. And let's see, who's next? Luke.
I would say that all three of these organizations are members of ICE, so I just support everything that they're saying.
All right. So this is the advice we are all getting, if I can type and talk at the same time. But we have a couple of windows, and we hope you will all join us. These organizations are our national leaders. Watch for their calls to action, and watch for your local association, Housing California, and us. And a big thank you for everyone who's taken part in this here today, both live, which is so fabulous to see everyone, and online. And keep hope going, and keep your advocacy going. Thank you. Thanks to our panel.
Thank you, Matt.